in an industry right now where all these practice owners are just complaining loudly about, more cuts and how much it hurts. What you're effectively saying, I think, is that, hey, look, in broad strokes, none of us can really directly do anything about those big cuts. But what we can do is actually participate in the conversations and get ourselves into those discussions with the right people to actually cancel out those larger cuts. I mean, that's kind of what you're saying, right? Is it like the cuts are just on paper, really just comes down to what's your actual contract with the payer, and let's actually get that a little higher. That's basically like what you're saying, right?
I guess there's a linear way to think about it, and then there's a kind of broader way to think about it. And we can start, I guess, first with linear. When a provider decides, okay, I'm going to start entering into these value based contracts rather than straight fee for service contracts, they sometimes start with just, we're going to make some small steps. And maybe that is things like, the value of a couple of the services, the prices are raised in exchange for things like a greater level of access. So having more hours available so that their patients can be seen within 24 hours, for example. So it's trade-offs essentially, right? You're going to identify when you start small. And let's think first about a provider at risk, because that's easier to conceptualize sometimes than the payer piece. If I'm thinking about approaching a primary care practice. And I know that in general, without looking at data, it's generally the things that they don't manage well are right low back pain and arthritis, referrals to specialists, to orthopedists, right, and patients falling and balance and those kinds of things, right. And so one of the stressors that they have, if they're also as a physician provider taking risk, they know their data, they know where their weak spots are. And so if we know what their weak spots are in their data, such as overutilization of specialists to see their patients diagnosed with low back pain or some kind of low back ICD-10 code. If we know that they are spending too much in that area, we can address that by offering a different solution. And we have to demonstrate how and why we're going to help them lower their spend. And therefore, we take some of that benefit in return. So it's really, we're having a conversation more about the true value in the language that the providers that are already in these contracts are taking. They need help in areas that they can't control well.
Yeah.
I'll make a parallel. I haven't done this before, I don't think, on this podcast or any podcast, but I'm going to make a parallel to something very common right now that practices are doing. And it's one type of patient. Okay. So there's a couple of organizations that do this, like Strive Health and Evergreen Health, right? And they're both, part of larger organizations that are funded through venture capital and other things. And they're nephrology groups. And they're nephrology risk sharers. So what they say to practices is things like, we will take on what they call subcapitated risk for your patients with end stage renal disease. We will own what happens to them, and we'll bet on ourselves to do a better job than you can because we know how to manage these patients better. We're going to build a care team around these specific patients. We know them from the claims data, who they are, right? We know who's ESRD. We're going to take that risk. We're going to do a better job. There's a lot of money at stake here, a lot of opportunity. They're very high cost, very high risk patients. We're both going to benefit. We're going to do a better job. You're going to benefit from it because they're your patients that are attributed to you and you own their spend. So both of us are going to save. The payer's going to save because they're going to spend less. You're going to benefit from it as a practice who owns these patients. And we're going to benefit from it as a nephrology group who's an expert in helping you solve this problem. The same is going to happen. It's already happening a little, but the same is going to happen with things like ortho. And as we look at musculoskeletal spend being the number one spend, yes, ESRD is in its own category, but when we talk about the average population, musculoskeletal spend is all over crazy. And orthopedics are not going to be the solution. The reason that nephrology is different, right, is because nephrology, a physician, a nephrologist is at the center of care. We all understand it's just a given. Someone has ESRD, end stage renal disease, that nephrologist rules the roost. Musculoskeletal is not the same, right?
Right.
If I have low back pain, or I have a derangement or whatever, there are some provider type that can help me. It's not going to be the primary care provider, right? They don't manage back pain. The primary care provider knows if that patient goes for imaging or goes to an orthopedist, the spend is going to go through the roof. and they're responsible for that spend as the primary care provider. We don't want a physician to own, unless there's a red flag, right? We're screening for any reasons. A physician needs to see the patient. But for that crazy musculoskeletal spend, where still, I know therapists don't have a line of sight into this like I do and others do, but there are very few patients as a whole that are going to PT, right, as a rule. And there is a huge opportunity to redirect those patients going to ortho to PT. So to be able to show whoever owns the dollars, to be able to show them, here is specifically where your historical spend is, and here's how we're going to help you manage that and reduce it by 50%. Very doable for something like, a practice that has high spend in orthopedic. So
Yeah.
is that, I know that's a roundabout answer, but just trying to paint the picture for therapists, like, what does it exactly mean to take risk? It means we know where the spend is, where it shouldn't be, and where it's avoidable, and we know how to avoid that spend, and we know how to make the experience better, and we know the primary care provider is incentivized to find a different solution, and the orthopedic is not going to be the solution. We're not going
Yeah.
to be able to contract with them to help us. We need a higher value provider. And that's why I always say that therapists are very high value. That's a great example of how.
If you'd like to learn more about Strata PT and see how our EMR and RCM works, head over to stratapt.com to book a demo.